You were alive before your memory began. You were breathing, crying, sleeping, learning, feeling. You were forming bonds with people you would love for the rest of your life, and you remember none of it. Not a single image, not a sound, not a feeling that you can trace back to those first years. Every experience from the most intense and formative period of your entire existence has vanished completely. Scientists call this infantile amnesia, and despite more than a century of research, they still do not fully agree on why it happens. But the closer you look at the explanations, the stranger the question becomes, because the mystery is not simply that the memories are gone. The mystery is what their absence tells you about the nature of memory itself, and about who you were before you became someone who could remember being you. To understand infantile amnesia, you first need to understand what memory requires. Memory is not a recording that switches on automatically when something happens. It is an active construction process that depends on specific biological systems working together. The most important of these systems is the hippocampus, a curved structure buried deep inside the brain that is essential for converting experiences into lasting memories. At birth, the human hippocampus is profoundly underdeveloped. The neurons are present, but the connections between them, the dense web of communication that makes lasting memory possible, have not yet formed. The infrastructure for long-term memory is simply not ready. This is the most straightforward part of the explanation, and it is almost certainly part of the answer, but it does not explain everything. Because babies are clearly learning. They recognize their mother's voice within hours of birth. They can be trained to associate sounds with rewards. They show clear preferences for familiar faces. Something is being stored. Something is shaping their behavior. But that something is not the kind of memory we carry into adulthood. Researchers distinguish between two broad types of memory. Explicit memory is the kind you can consciously access and describe. The memory of your first day at a new school, a conversation you had, a meal you remember eating. Implicit memory operates beneath awareness. It shapes how you move, what you feel comfortable with, what makes you anxious, how you respond to familiar sounds or faces. Babies appear to be forming implicit memories constantly from the very beginning. What they are not yet forming is explicit autobiographical memory, the kind that would allow them to later say, "I remember this." But even this distinction does not fully close the question, because children between the ages of 2 and 3 often do form memories that feel like explicit personal memories at the time. If you ask a 2-year-old what happened at their birthday party last week, they can tell you. The memory is clearly there. But ask the same person about that party 20 years later, and the memory is gone. Something does not just prevent the memories from forming, something erases them afterward. This is one of the most puzzling findings in memory research. The memories exist, and then they disappear. One leading explanation involves neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus. During the first years of life, the hippocampus produces new neurons at an extremely high rate. This is essential for the brain's rapid development. But each new neuron integrates itself into the existing network by forming new connections, and in doing so, it can disrupt and overwrite the older connection patterns that stored the earlier memories. The very process that builds the brain may be systematically dismantling its earliest records. Researchers studying this in animals have found supporting evidence. When neurogenesis is artificially slowed in young animals, they retain earlier memories better. When it is artificially accelerated in adult animals, previously formed memories begin to fade. The developing brain may be erasing itself as it grows. But there is another dimension to this question that neuroscience alone cannot fully answer. Memory is not just biology, it is also language. To store a memory in the way that allows you to later retrieve it and tell someone about it, you need a narrative framework. You need the concept of past and future. You need words for what you experienced. You need a sense of yourself as a continuous person who existed yesterday and will exist tomorrow. Very young children do not yet have these tools. They experience the world fully and intensely, but they do not yet have the linguistic and conceptual structure to encode that experience into a storable, retrievable personal narrative. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Mark Johnson has argued that the self as a narrative entity, the you who has a life story, comes into existence gradually through language. Before language, there may be experience without a narrator, something that feels, reacts, and learns, but cannot yet file the experience under the label, "This happened to me." This idea produces one of the quieter and more unsettling implications of infantile amnesia. The person who lived through your first years may have been, in a meaningful sense, a different kind of self from the one who emerged later. Not a lesser self, not an incomplete self, but a self without a story. A self that experienced without recording. a self that felt without filing. And when the narrative self finally arrived, equipped with language and memory and the concept of personal history, it found no records waiting. The earlier self had left almost nothing behind, almost nothing, because there is one category of trace that does survive. Implicit memories from infancy do persist. The emotional residue of early experiences shapes adult psychology in ways that researchers are still mapping. The security or anxiety you felt in early relationships influences how you attach to people decades later. The sounds and rhythms of language spoken around you in your first years shape your ear for music and speech for the rest of your life. The emotional tone of your earliest environment leaves a pattern that influences your nervous system long after the specific memories that created it have vanished. You carry the effects of those years everywhere you go. You simply cannot remember the causes. This is perhaps the most quietly profound aspect of infantile amnesia. The experiences that shaped you most deeply are precisely the ones you cannot access. The relationships that formed your understanding of trust, safety, and love occurred before you could record them. The version of yourself that first encountered the world, that first felt warmth, hunger, fear, comfort, and recognition, lived an entire chapter of your story without leaving a single page you can read. And yet that chapter is still there, written in the way you move through the world, in what makes you feel safe, in what makes you afraid, in the way you reach towards certain people and step back from others. You are still living with conclusions drawn from evidence you can no longer see, which brings the question to its quietest and most difficult place. If that early self existed, felt, learned, and shaped everything that came after, but left no memories you can retrieve, in what sense were you there at all? And if the answer is that you were there completely, that every moment was real and felt and full, then what does that say about all the moments happening right now that future versions of you will also forget? There was a version of you that saw everything for the first time. The first color, the first face, the first feeling of being held. That version of you is gone now, but the world it built is the world you are standing in.